As the date to Squadrons looms ever so closer, I thought now would be a good time to talk about how Squadrons truly became to be. After all, Star Wars Squadrons wasn't a game that just magically came together. The game has been built up from numerous older games from the 80s and 90s, only then to finally appear once more in 2020. So in today's video, we'll be covering all the games in the Star Wars franchise that slowly brought itself up to the game that we'll be getting in October. Some will be more relatable to Squadrons than others, and some are even mentioned as direct influences by Ian Fraser, creative director of said game. But before I get into the video, my question of the day for all of you is, have you pre-ordered Star Wars Squadrons? And more specifically, was there any moment during the game's current lifespan where you decided you were going to pre-order? Was it the announcement trailer, gameplay trailer, the short CG animation? Let me know all your comments down below. We read all of them and try to get back to some of you too. And for those of you who are interested, I've just released our bonus monthly video for our EcksToo patrons and YouTube members. It's a full, in-depth recording of how you can win in skirmish modes as New Republic in Empire at War Thrawn's Revenge. So if you fancy checking that out, be sure to pledge at the $5 perk or above to get your hands on it. But with that out of the way, let's dive right into the video. For our first game, we must teleport all the way back to the early 80s. Arcades were hitting the youth like a storm, and arcade cabinets were raking in a fortune. But one of those games that came out in 1983 was Star Wars, and despite Star Wars' emotional rollercoaster when it came to games, this was one of the top-selling arcade games of 1983. Much like how Star Wars franchise liked to be pioneers in the new technology of film, this was a prime example of a new generation of graphics in gaming. Its crisp 3D vector-based wireframes might look primitive to anybody watching now, but it was a first for rendering a player in a 3D space. Just take a look at some of these game developers trying to shift from 2D to 3D in the home console era. Not many survived the transition. So when Atari decided, you know what, let's just make it 3D, lol, in the early 80s, over a decade before the N64 and PS1, you should start to get a better idea of just how this game blew kids' minds back then. This was the same year Mario Bros was released, or Mappy, or Tapper. I mean, who remembers Tapper? Not me, I wasn't even alive for it. Actually, Tapper's kind of iconic, but it generally had nothing on Star Wars. The gameplay is pretty straightforward. You're in a semi-first-person view and your job is simple. Take on Darth Vader and his TIE fighters and then blow up the Death Star. Very easy stuff. The game did have ports, however, the two most notable ones being the Atari 5200, which looked relatively similar to the original, but the gameplay really suffered, and an inferior Atari 2600 version, which just looked awful. But hey, if you ever decided to play Squadrons on the lowest settings and on 4 FPS, just go ahead and play the Commodore 64 version, you'll love it. But if you were hoping for another flight sim Star Wars game in the 80s, you're out of luck, because it wasn't until a decade later in 1993 where we saw the first home console Star Wars flight sim. Now here, we're definitely starting to see big similarities. Just looking at the cockpit UI, you can already start taking a one-to-one comparison to that of Squadrons. Whilst yes, you are literally following the interior designs of an X-Wing, the gameplay is also similar too, as you're able to fine-tune your ship's engines, firepower and shields, alongside very similar UI for pushing shields to the front or back. Whilst the cockpit was a flat 2D image slapped across the screen, what you saw past the glass was full 3D models. For something in 1993, this was definitely impressive. Many 2D platformers were flooding the market after the influence of Sonic the Hedgehog and Super Mario Bros on the SNES. But it wasn't until Doom, which came out the same year as X-Wing, was there finally strong contenders for the first-person market. But seriously, if you're actually dedicated to the idea of becoming a good Star Wars Squadrons player, pick up this game alongside the next two games we're going to tell you about, because the gameplay here is very similar. Granted, it's a single player game compared to Squadron's more multiplayer centric gameplay, but it should still help you get the understanding of the mechanics and micromanaging your ship, prioritizing hard points on capital ships and just generally being a better shot. If you think you had to wait another decade for another Star Wars flight sim game, you'd be very wrong, as in no more than a year later, TIE Fighter, the sequel to X-Wing, released in 1994. In fact, this game was the most iconic Star Wars flight sim of the lot. Many Star Wars critics like to state this being one of the greatest Star Wars games of all time. I will, however, state, despite its very similar appearance to Squadrons, it is not the most influential to its 2020 release. Whilst not much here looks different compared to the X-Wing game, some minor improvements were made under the hood. 3D models saw a bit of a bump in graphics, making it easier to distinguish fighters and capital ships in your view, but most notably was the enemy AI in the game. Whilst for gameplay it doesn't show much more beyond what we already know from X-Wing, The storyline is what got most people interested. It was the first for taking a look through the eyes of an Imperial. What was it like to serve the Empire, to essentially be the bad guy? The Rebels win over the Empire a lot, so for some it was nice to see the tables turn for once. And hey, the CG short for Squadrons kinda did the same thing too, rooting for the Empire once again. Who would have thought? Next up in the line of the confusing titles for Star Wars games, X-Wing vs TIE Fighter in 1997. Now this was the most defining game for Star Wars Squadrons. Ian Fraser himself stated that this game played a big part in the development of Squadrons, and looking at the gameplay you can really tell. This was a few years after TIE Fighter, so the graphics had a significant bump, and the cockpit UI left behind the pixelated look. This generally looks like a Squadrons prequel, but it wasn't just the graphics and gameplay that was similar, it was in fact that it was an online multiplayer focused as well. After the popularity of multiplayer shooters like Doom and Descent, which took the PC world by storm, X-Wing vs TIE Fighter did the same. Granted, not many fans enjoyed this, they were more invested in the single player narrative, and I wouldn't blame them. The previous two games were known for their fantastic cutscenes. This game is the absolute closest you're going to get to Squadrons before it releases, even more so than Starfighter Assault game mode in Battlefront 2. So if you want a head start against your enemies, pick up this game on GOG or Steam. You won't regret it. And finally, X-Wing Alliance coming in just a few years after in 1999. A sequel to all three games mentioned previously. Just releasing at the cusp of the 6th generation of video game consoles, X-Wing Alliance took the flight sim and put it into the 3D realm, bolstering pretty darn impressive graphics for its time too. Whilst the UI and interfaces start to stray away from what Squadrons is all about, the feel of the 3D environment and a more realistic appeal to actually feeling that you're up for it. It returns back to being a single player narrative experience first and foremost, and whilst I do recommend spending your time honing your skills in X-Wing vs TIE Fighter, I do really recommend picking up this game to follow up the conclusion of the story from both X-Wing and TIE Fighter and the 7 years of the X-Wing project as a whole. Whilst there are plenty more Star Wars games that have you sitting in a cockpit of an X-Wing or a TIE Fighter, many of these games really diverge away from Squadron's true core. Rogue Squadron is a brilliant flight simulator, but its third-person gameplay is completely different to what you'll experience in Squadrons. Star Wars Starfighter follows the same path, third-person with very arcadey-styled gameplay. Games like Star Wars Galaxy's Jump to Lightspeed and Battlefront 2 didn't have space flight simulation as their main focal point, so whilst it's nice to mention them and make myself sound competent, I felt like they didn't really deserve their own section in this video. Overall, the entirety X-Wing project kinda serves as a prequel to Squadrons, a base for it to start from and improve upon with today's graphics and peripherals. X-Wing v TIE Fighter tried following the trends of Doom Online and its clones, but it was already knee-deep in a storyline that its fans wanted more of. Thankfully, that game has finally found a space in gaming history within Star Wars Squadrons, for it to really shine and show its worth. But that doesn't mean itself and the games before it and after it doesn't show a clear evolutionary path that leads to Squadrons. X-Wing, TIE Fighter, X-Wing vs TIE Fighter, and X-Wing Alliance all showed big leaps in improvement and change between one another, and when you cram all of them together, you get Squadrons. But with that leads me to my outro. For the two people still watching, don't forget our question of the day, which is, have you pre-ordered Star Wars Squadrons? Let me know in the comments down below. I want to see who I might play against when it releases. And finally guys, we are like so close to 100,000 subscribers now, it is absolutely crazy. So if you're one of the 60% who have not subscribed yet, now is the best time to do it. But other than that, I've been Charlie, you've been watching EcksToo, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.